Hello and welcome to Succession. So in this video I'm going to talk you through the idea of succession. You're going to have a go at a few questions and hopefully by the end of it your understanding of succession will be much better. So what is succession? Succession is a series of changes over a period of time, and that's the bit that students struggle with. So when I mean a period of time, I mean over a series of years. So each of these diagrams below are representing a series of time. So we might have in the first 10 years, we might have in the next 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years. So as time goes by over a series of years, this specific place is changing. So a 10-year period, it's bare rock. Then we get a few plants after 20 years. After 30 years, they start to evolve into larger plants. And then by 40 years, we'll end up with a full-on forest. So we start within the 10-year period with bare rock. And suddenly, after 10 years, it's evolving to be able to support plant life. But how does it actually change? So at the start, what we have to begin with is erosion, weathering, whatever you want to call it. The idea is the rock is broken down, and this is through wind, rain, all these things that are eroding the rock, making the inorganic ions within the rock available to the plant. And once that's available to the plants can start to colonize, key term there, the area. So once erosion has taken place, this is where the changes happen. So after about a 20-year period, which is just an approximate number, plants start to colonise. And these plants have a very specific name. They're called pioneer species. And the pioneer species are adapted to be able to survive in these very harsh abiotic conditions. If you think about it, when the rock is simply eroded, there's not much soil, therefore there's not much water retention, therefore there's not many nutrients. It could be very windy, it could be very exposed, it might not have a large amount of shelter. There are loads of abiotic factors that are affecting whether this plant can grow. And only very specialised, very adapted plants will be able to grow in these harsh abiotic conditions. So now we have plant life, succession can technically begin. So the idea of this pioneer species is they speed up the process of change. They change the environment in many ways. One of the main ways in which they do so is they create soil. Soil cannot be created from simply rock. It has to include dead organic matter, and this is where the plants come into it. Unfortunately, the first soil will be created when these pioneer species die, decompose, and build up the soil layer. And in doing so, they're making these harsh abiotic conditions less harsh. So once we've got soil, that is a free-for-all now. Any other plant species that are able will come and colonise. And the unfortunate nature is that the small, delicate pioneer species that are specialised to this harsh abiotic conditions, they're then going to be outcompeted by the larger, more dominant species that are now able to grow. These larger, less specialised plants can also change the environment. So again, one example is that they will die as well. They will add to the soil, and this soil layer and the nutrient content of the soil will improve and improve and improve. And this is a cycle. This will continue and continue and continue until we get to the idea of a climax community. This is going to be our final stage of succession. So over about a 40-year period, we'll eventually reach a climax community. So as time goes by, the species get larger, they outcompete the previous species until we eventually reach our climax community. And that's often going to be a forest. Now, once we reach the climax community, all these harsh abiotic conditions, the soil content, the nutrient content, the wind, the rain, the fact that there's not shelter, that doesn't matter anymore. In this environment, it's incredibly stable. The trees are larger, they have enough nutrients, the soil depth is going to be sufficient to allow larger plants to be able to grow. The conditions are ideal for these trees. And as they are ideal for these trees, the whole ecosystem becomes more stable. The more trees or plants there are, the more habitats there are, the more food sources there are, and therefore there will be more animals. The whole biodiversity of that area will increase as time goes by, and it will stay like this unless there is a disturbance. The climax community will stay like this for a long period of time if nothing else happens. So along the top of the arrow now, at the top of the screen, we have a few things that will change. So the stability of the ecosystem will increase, the size of the plants will increase, the number of plants will increase, and now in our climax community, the biotic factors are going to be favoured. So predation is more important, competition is more important. All these things mean the ecosystem is much more stable. So an example of things that might decrease are the effect of the abiotic conditions. It doesn't matter now if there's a drought, if there's a storm. The trees that are established here are so stable that these abiotic conditions won't necessarily affect their ability to grow. The harsh nature of the environment as well means that they are suitable to stay there for a long period of time. So the climax community is this type of forest that you've seen before. Now this type of succession that we've actually talked about is one type of succession, primary succession. This is where we're going from bare rock all the way to the climax community, and secondary succession, which I'll talk about in a second, is slightly different. Okay, so we've talked about the main aspects of succession now. Time to have a go at a few questions. So we're having a go at 3, 5 and 6, which will appear on the screen. If you need to review any areas of the video, please feel free to rewind and make sure you ask. The idea of these sessions is to ask for help. So moving on to secondary succession. So the only slight difference between this type of succession and primary succession is the availability of soil. Primary succession takes so long because we need to establish this soil. We need to wait for bare rock to erode, for the ions to be available, and then for the pioneer species to colonise, and so on and so forth. With secondary succession, it's all happened before. So we've got to a climax community, we've had this very stable ecosystem, but something's happened. In many cases, it's fire, it could be flood, it could be radioactivity, it could be something that's caused all the vegetation to disappear. But what is left is the soil. Soil is the key. Now, the reason that the soil isn't so important is because it has the ability to hold water, it has nutrients, but it can also hold other things. For instance, seeds. Seeds still may be available in the soil after whatever disturbance has happened. And therefore, for these pioneer species to come back, it's much easier. So the stages of succession are very similar in terms of we'll still get pioneer species colonising the area, and these pioneer species will change the harsh abiotic conditions. Not so much in the soil, they will improve the soil, but they can also include shelter, making more vegetation, allowing more species to be able to colonise that area. So our intermediate species are representing those that will outcompete the pioneers and be able to survive and reproduce and also change the environment. And then eventually the climax community will outcompete those intermediate species. So this cycle of things happening and changing the environment occurs over and over again until the climax community is reached. So the main difference in these types of succession is primary, there is no soil, starts from bare rock. Secondary, there is soil remaining after some kind of disturbance, whatever it may be, but the soil is still there. So we have a little bit of application that I'd like to introduce you to. So this is simply a graph showing the abundance, the amount of each of these different species. Now in succession they like to use the very specific names of the plants that occur, but you don't need to know them. They're just there to mean this is that type of species. You don't need to know them. You can reference them in your answer if you like, but there's no necessity to do so. So in this graph you can see that you've got the annual herbs, the grasses, the birch, the spruce and the dwarf shrubs. And they're lined peak and trough at various different points. Now the one that appears at the beginning, the annual shrubs, they're going to be our pioneers. These are going to be our they're going to are adapted to specialised environments. So they're going to be able to survive in these harsh abiotic conditions where there might not be a lot of water, there might not be a lot of nutrients. They're adapted to those conditions. So once these annual herbs have changed the environment sufficiently, they've added the soil, they've made it less harsh, the grasses are able to colonise. And as the grasses increase, they're outcompeting the annual herbs. And in doing so, you can see a large decline in the annual herbs' abundance as the grasses are increasing. So the grasses increase, they'll be changing the environment, they'll be adding more to the soil, they'll be making it less harsh, and therefore the birch can survive. And you can see how this is going. The birch survive, and therefore they can colonise. The grasses' abundance will decline because the birch are outcompeting the grasses. And then the birch are changing the environment for the better. They're making it less harsh, they're adding to the soil, and they're making it available to species such as the dwarf shrubs and the spruces. And this will continue over and over again until we reach that climax community, such as spruce trees, whose line will stay very high, their abundance will remain high, because there's not many other organisms or other species that can outcompete the trees. So the last bit of succession is conservation. So conservation, as it says, is the management of natural resources, but why do we want to do it? So yes, it can be personal, ethical or economic or cultural reason, but the whole point of conservation is to stop the trees taking over. And yes, climax communities are brilliant and all that, but with a climax community, with a forest, it can have quite damaging effects to the whole ecosystem. So we have two pictures here. We've got a forest and we've got some grasslands. Now, if the whole point of conservation is maintaining biodiversity and habitats, then a forest isn't the ideal conditions. You can see there are quite a few number of plants living under the trees, but the variety of them is going to be quite limiting. The trees are taking a large amount of the sunlight away from the ground, so only very specific types of plants will be able to live in these shaded conditions. The rest of the nutrients and the rest of the light are occupied by exactly the same species as tree. So even though within succession we do say in a climax community there is a high biodiversity, sometimes because of the number of trees and because of the fact that there is the same type of tree, the biodiversity is quite limited, and in some cases the habitats can be limited. On the right hand side you can see the grassland. Now this is what we would like to see if we were doing conservation. Essentially the climax community is stopped. We cannot get to the forest because for some reason the trees are not able to colonise. This is on purpose. We're doing this as part of conservation, and you can see in the picture, very nice picture it is, that there are a lot more varieties of plants. And if there are a lot more varieties of plants, yes, they're small grasses, but this means there's a higher biodiversity. More species, more biodiversity, therefore more habitats. Now, how we actually do the conservation can be in many different ways. So the list at the top here introduces us to the idea of what type of conservation we can employ. So we could plough the fields to prevent the climax communities being established. We can do weeding, we can do herbicides, we can burn the area, which will prevent any tree seedlings being able to colonise. We can do crop planting, and we can use grazing animals, all aimed at stopping the climax community from being established. So that's it for conservation and for succession. Now time to have a go at a few more questions. So question 1, question 2 and question 4 from your little booklets. They will appear on the screen. Remember, this is your opportunity to ask. Please don't be shy. Please ask or watch the video again if there's anything that you need help with.